So, Matt, please go ahead.
Please tell me what screen you can see before I go ahead. Are you seeing a large screen or a smaller screen?
A large screen, our changing world.
And I just want to see if you've got... Is that a big
screen? It's even better, yes.
Great. I'm having to learn technology on two screens here. So kia ora, everybody, and thank you very much indeed, Iris and Fionn and all the colleagues who've talked amazingly about a fantastic project. It's going to be a real benefit. And it falls to me because Theo asked me to speak about this, to try to put this in a broader context. So I hope that I rise to the challenge here. So I'm going to talk about our changing world, the involvement of horses in sport and leisure, and some of the issues that we face and some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves. So first of all, I think it's clear that we live in a very changing world, and you know, certainly whatever aspect of the equestrian world we look at, we've got to recognize that we look at it within a world context or a global context. And so, you know, whether it's pandemics, whether it's the effect that war has on availability of the things that we require, whether that's to do with water scarcity or food security, or ecosystems and biodiversity. These are all big issues that are facing all industries at the moment. And one of the big things that I'm quite intrigued by is the technological opportunities, but the challenges that we face as a result of this. And of course, it's fantastic that we have amazing ways to communicate, such as these webinars and Zooms and so on, and that we have many, many different social media platforms available to us, because that provides us with a great way to communicate about ideas and research such as this in relation to sustainability, if we use them appropriately as part of our human behavior change or informative models. And just the data shows us the number of people and the number of ways that we can reach people just through social media. And that's obviously much greater now. That's up to 2018. But it also has an impact on the speed at which inaccurate information can be spread around. And also ideas and pictures and things that are obviously a problem from a social license point of view. We also have mechanisms, as you can see here. I'm showing you this picture of me on Margaret, who is I'm told it's not a mechanical horse, it's a simulation horse at Hartbury University just about 2 days ago before I got on the plane and came back. And, you know, it is quite an incredible experience for me to finally leave the ground and jump a proper row of oxers jumps, having only been poddling around doing flat work for the last number of years on a simulation horse. And it does beg the question, in fact, was asked in my Facebook post when I was telling everybody about how interesting it all was, you know, well, why do you need a real horse then, if you can get the same sort of excitement and enjoyment from something that, you know, that it can be programmed to do things. And the same goes for the information that we can program and provide, such as this carbon hoofprint model that Iris and colleagues are working on. So what was thought impossible is no longer necessarily so, but also what was deemed acceptable previously may not be necessarily so. And so we have some what I call big rocks. These are big global challenges that face all of us and all of our industries at the moment. And underpinning all of this is a guide to businesses around the global sustainability development goals, economic pillars, the environmental pillars, and the social pillars. And this is obviously where things like the environmental impact of our horses, the welfare impact that we have on our horses, and other things such as inequalities and so on will all be discussed, because this should be part of our guiding approach. So the impact of climate change on animals, we know what it is on humans, we know about habitat loss and so on, but it's, you know, it has a major impact on populations of animals, but it also has an impact on the welfare of individual animals. So then we move over to humans, because they have such a big impact on whether or not we do the right thing in terms of environment or animals. And we have to understand how the changing world has also impacted on their changing societal values, on their values and their attitudes when it comes to the environment or animals or other things. And I think a lot of the time research is being done mostly by senior researchers who are not Gen Z. And most of us who talk about equestrian issues tend to be a little bit older, and we're certainly not necessarily reflective of the world that, the future world that equestrianism will be viewed within. So if you just look at Gen Z, you can see that if they're asked about the food system in the future, what they're interested in is more information and improvements in animal welfare, reducing environmental impact, more sustainable production, all those sorts of things. And these things matter to our future equestrians. And one of the big things that Gen Z seem to be very concerned with is responsibility to address environmental and social issues. And if those of you out there have got children who are particularly opinionated about these matters, then you will know that you are to blame. As far as my children are concerned, we have ruined the planet, and now we're going to leave it, and they are going to have to be stuck with the problem. So, it's quite an interesting discussion at the moment in our household anyway. These changing social values, whether it's to do with environmental impact or animal welfare concerns, or indeed other issues, they drive the way in which we view different industries. And for example, when we look just at animal use, we can see major changes in the production sector, particularly to do with what is considered to be acceptable from production of meat or milk and other animal products through research and testing. What animals can be used for in terms of so-called therapy. Even leisure has come under fire. I know in some parts of Europe there are questions asked about pet keeping and riding horses, and certainly within sport, the racing of animals or the using of animals for our own enjoyment or our own profit. So these are big questions that will continue to evolve as we see changing social values. So what we're talking about when we're talking about changing societal values is changing expectations, changing tolerances, and that drives changing, I suppose, views around what is acceptable or what is sanctioned in terms of an activity. And we call this social license to operate. And lots of industries are obviously in this game, and they worry about their social license. There are lots of different issues within the business sector. Certainly within different sports, you've got different levels of concern. And the equestrian sport particularly is quite unique because it involves an animal that's considered to be vulnerable to the human sort of dimension, and it's certainly vulnerable to negative public opinion. So other industries, what's interesting when you start to look at other industries, and obviously my sort of expertise is within animal welfare, but it has been interesting to me how much sustainability has become kind of part of animal welfare, or animal welfare has become part of sustainability, that kind of link. When you ask people to define what they mean by sustainability for beef, the number one thing they talk about is animal welfare, and then its environmental aspects. When you talk to the chicken industry, they will say welfare and sustainability are inseparable. When you talk to the pork industry, they will talk about sustainability being to do with the environment, animal welfare, food safety, and so on. So it's kind of, when we talk about these things, we're not talking about something in isolation. We're talking about the links between these values and concerns. The pet industry, that is increasingly, you're starting to see discussions about global citizens or environmental impacts of pets. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm sure that will be a whole area of research for Buckingham once they've finished with horses, if they're not doing it already. And then there's the examples of evolving concerns related to equestrianism. So, when you look at, a lot of the concerns, depending on where you are in the world, those concerns range from land availability for horse activities, the financial aspects of keeping a horse, Some people are concerned about the human rights, you know, what happens to people who are working in the industry. Then there's the environmental impact that we've just had a talk about. And then there's the area of welfare and the ethics of horse use. And when I talk about the welfare and ethics of horse use, this is obviously something that you see an awful lot of questions and social media and media articles about. You probably see less about sustainability in horse keeping at the moment. But I suspect that just as we have seen a rise in these sorts of questions, so there will also be a rise in other questions if we don't move swiftly to address things. So social license, just to be clear, is about maintaining legitimacy, being credible, holding oneself accountable, positively engaging where there are concerns, and committing to change where change is needed. And all of that maintains a trust that provides that social license. And the importance of social license is that it means that an industry can self-regulate. That's pretty much it. It means it's accepted and it can be self-regulating, and it can thrive as a result of that. Where credibility and confidence in an industry drops below the tipping point, then one sees heavy legislation and even banning of that organization or that activity because it becomes socially controlled. And we've got examples of where environmental impact, in fact, this is one of the biggest areas where social license is lost for many industries in many different areas. For me, I live in New Zealand. We have a clean, green, supposed country. We've just had a big cyclone, certainly in the area that I live in. We have been absolutely devastated by the amount of what's called brash that's come down from the forestry industry that has basically chopped trees, removed trees, left debris that has now slipped down the hillsides into the water and taken out most of the bridges and water and ruined our landscape. And that has really had a big impact on the public, who probably didn't really know much about it before, but they certainly do now. The dairy industry is another one that's had some pretty bad press around their use of water, particularly in New Zealand, the way in which land has been reclaimed for the dairy industry, the impact of nitrates in the waterways, etc. And so they've really had to think about how they rescue their credibility. So when these industries have thought about sustainability or their environmental footprint or impact, they've had to really think about this in a real way, because for maintaining a license to operate, you've got to see sustainability as not something that's about differentiating the market or some sort of marketing strategy. It is actually about maintaining the self-regulation and that trust. And the consequences of losing social license over whether it's welfare or environmental impact is that there is no going back. Once it's gone, it's gone. And here's some examples of 3 industries or 3 activities that are no longer able to be carried out because of loss of social confidence and trust. So greyhound racing, jump racing, and of course this is the pentathlon with Saint Boy. So the industries that evolve, that actually take some action early on, can see the writing on the wall, they survive a little bit better. So whilst you may or may not agree with wild animals being kept in zoos or indeed in circuses, this example is to sort of illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. And that is that both zoos and circuses were basically a place for wildlife to be watched and see them perform for our own enjoyment. And circuses and zoos were under fire equally for what they did. However, circuses basically remained as an entertainment activity, and in most parts of Europe particularly, there's no longer able to be wild animals being used in circuses. Whereas zoos changed their narrative. They did quite a lot of research, which is what this bubble diagram is showing, the rise in the number of papers that they wrote, and they focused around education, population conservation type work, and certainly talking a lot about individual welfare. And that legitimized this industry and enabled them to remain sort of ahead of the curve, if you like. And the same goes for research. There's an awful lot, certainly when I was a student and a young lecturer, there was a lot of fear about calling yourself an animal scientist because of the fear of animal rights groups. There was a lot of opinion, a lot of suspicion about what went on behind closed doors. And the research industry moved to change that narrative again by being more open in the way in which they talked about research, committing far more obviously to ensuring high standards of welfare and a very clear way in which decisions were made about what could or could not be done on animals. And the 3 R's of animal research is one of the ways in which this is done. So these industries evolved as a result of what they could see was happening in terms of public opinion. So the equine industry also needs to understand the current status of SLO and what the tipping points might be. And in order to do that, as we've just had a discussion around, we need information. We need to know what the situation is. So, for example, here we have horses that are fit to compete and items of tack and equipment all being viewed differently, and we need to understand what the particular concerns might be. Because if we can keep the balance favorable, we can maintain social license. Now we do that by ensuring that whatever is likely to come along that we can't predict, we've actually got a good base that people can trust, that people, yes, a trust base, if you like. And in this case, particularly with the equine industry at the moment, because we know from the data that we've collected that horse welfare is a major concern, if we ensure that the horse base around welfare is trusted because we can demonstrate the work's being done, then whatever comes along will not necessarily tip us in the wrong direction. Money in the bank, that's called. So I'm just going to give you an example of the work that we have been doing for the FEI in relation to equine ethics and well-being. And this all started really with, I think, the FEI board deciding that they needed to address some of the negative press, I think, that there was at the time. And then Ingmar coming out and saying that we want to embrace this scrutiny to drive change. And a commission was put together, and it was a commission initially to look at social license to operate, which we know is very broad. And so we refined that to look at the thing that we knew was of most concern at this time about horses in sport, and that was to do with welfare. And we said that this commission is really addressing ethics and well-being, and it's there to guide the FEI in relation to regulations, policies, and practices. And what we did was to try to collect as much evidence and information as we could, because we knew we had a challenge ahead to convince both the FEI and the equestrian stakeholders and the public that what we were doing, what we were suggesting, was based on information that was relevant and up to date. So in terms of data collection, we carried out some very big scale surveys, and the public from different countries in the world who responded differently told us that they were concerned about the involvement of horses in sport. And then we went on to say, well, what are you concerned about? They were concerned mainly about horses welfare, this is the blue bar, and horses safety, this is the orange bar. They were concerned about the impact of horse sport on the environment. We didn't direct them too much on this, but it was of lesser interest at the moment. It'll be interesting to see how that changes over time. And they were interested in human safety, the little grey bar, but it was of little less concern than human and horse safety. And then we sort of asked them about, well, tell us a little bit about what you consider to be a concern in relation to welfare. And 67% of the public felt welfare standards weren't adequate or couldn't be provided for in the sport. And we also looked at these different lenses about the public and the equestrian lens, and we asked them, do horses enjoy being involved in sport? And you can see, quite surprisingly, those who didn't really have much to do with horses said mostly not. But actually 50% of those who have a lot to do with horses and ride them and spend time with them, 50% of those said mostly not, which is obviously quite concerning, because if they think that their horses aren't enjoying what they do with them, then it does beg the question, why are they doing it? Anyway, long story short, won't go into all the detail because you can look at all of this on the Commission's website. But the survey results that we used to address concerns were able to be statistically packaged into 6 priority focus areas for the FEI. And don't forget, these were about equine welfare. So when the question was asked earlier about what will the EEF do when they get all this information about carbon and sustainability, it will be a similar sort of approach, I'm sure, where there are priority focus areas that guide recommendations. And in this case, in welfare, the priority focus areas were the first and the top one was training, riding, tack and equipment. And you can see as you go around this little circle that the one that was a priority focus area, but considered to be of less importance than the first one, was horses not being fit to compete and masking health problems. And we were able to use these priority focus areas along with all of the data that's already out there from the research that has been carried out on horses to be able to provide a total of 30 recommendations to the FEI board. And we grouped those recommendations into these strategic areas, if you like, because these were the areas that are important when it comes to social license to operate, leadership and trust and so on. And you can get a lot of information from this site if you want to download some of the key documents and the survey results and so on. So what we realized as we were going through this is that small steps when it comes to equine welfare can make quite a big difference, not just to the individual horse, but to the overall view of the industry. What was interesting to us was just by talking about these 30 recommendations publicly, engaging with stakeholder groups, putting it out on social media, meant that when we carried out a further pulse survey just recently, that a large proportion of those respondents said that they could see that a number of different activities had happened over the last year that made them more confident about horses being able to enjoy a good life when it came to being involved in sport. So small steps can make a big difference. And I suppose that these small steps, particularly around sustainability, relate to things that we can actually do as individuals, obviously with the right information, to be able to replace some of the things that we do, reduce some of the things we do, perhaps reuse some of the resources that we take advantage of, and certainly recycle. When we look at responsible equestrianism, we're talking about these two, I think, pillars really at the moment. Being able to demonstrate that we have a minimal environmental impact as we enjoy our sport, but also being able to be welfare centric, considering what the specific context of the sport horse might be in relation to the information that we have. So we know quite a lot about what horses need and want in terms of good diet and so on, but we also can overlay that now with information that Iris and colleagues have been able to talk to us about that will help us to make better choices to legitimize, if you like, our sport. And of course, within the context of the sport horse, we will have to have further information that relates, that provides that kind of map that allows people to make decisions about the things that horses experience inside competition as well as outside of competition and transport. When we look at responsible equestrianism, I'm going to make this point here because I do think it's important that it's not lots and lots of things. There's quite a big relationship between all of this. So if we just look at the feeding here, so the data that we've just been looking at about a 1-year-old horse or a 12-year-old horse, and all the lovely information that there is around the way in which manure is being disposed of and the different ways that contributes to greenhouse gases, can also relate to the things it does to individual horses. So, for example, when we talk about feeding, there is a problem mostly with leisure horses of overfeeding. So you have a lot of fat horses out there, and that obesity is a welfare problem for those horses. But it also creates a lot of excess manure, and it also takes a lot of food. If you're continuing to feed horses to that level. Protein is another one. A lot of grain has a lot of protein in it, but protein we know also has quite a problem in terms of nitrate leaching and other things that might impact on the environment. But it has a problem for horse health too when it's when it's done to excess. Feed choices, we've just talked about different types of grain and different types of sources of food and fibre, but we also know not just that it has an impact on resource use and environmental impact, but it has an impact on the horse's behavioural health. And that is a problem very often for the horse, particularly if it's fed the wrong food and it ends up developing a whole range of ulcers or stereotypies to cope with those ulcers. And I can go on. I mean, transport, there's some recommendations in the Commission's 30 recommendations around understanding the frequency and length of transport journeys that the sports horse has. But that's not just for welfare, as we've just heard, that is also for the environment. How many people turn up to horse shows with one horse in the back of a large vehicle? You know, what would happen if we had some sort of vehicle sharing or, I don't know, bus lane type approach to that? What about the choice of vehicle? Is towing a float or a trailer better than driving a horse truck? So there's a whole range of different things that impact on the horse, but they also impact on the environment. I'm not going to go into all of these, but these are fantastic questions to be able to answer with the data that we've got. So using these 4 R's, replace, reduce, reuse and recycle, we can make small changes that do make a big difference. And I think that these sorts of papers now you're starting to see is a recent paper co-written by a colleague of mine at Massey University here in New Zealand, that I think gives some really good information about the way in which horse diets can have a negative impact on the environment. Now, the problem with having all of this data, and this was, I suppose, what I was asked to talk about, is that you have to actually be able to use it to change human behaviour. So we might have the data, but we also have to recognise the challenge that we have, whether it's welfare or sustainability, because a lot of the time people are quite satisfied with the way in which things are at the moment. And even if you do challenge them, as we have with some of the Commission's recommendations, we end up sometimes being in a situation where there's a denial and then there's quite a bit of resistance. And you have to find a way to communicate and convince that takes us around that resistance point and into an area where people are prepared to explore and use the data and then commit to something new. We need human behaviour change expertise as part of these teams to add to the science so that we understand why humans do the things that they do and what will drive them to change, so that we can then help them to make more sustainable change that's going to benefit the welfare of the horse and the welfare of the planet. And we know that human behaviour change, or the modification of human behaviour, relies on us working not just at individual level, but also through society or culture, different professions, then obviously trying to ensure that that works globally. So changes, as I said before, changes have to be sustainable across the whole equine industry, not just one portion of it, not just Europe or countries within Europe, but wider too. And there's lots of different theories of human behaviour change, which I won't go into now, but it is its own sort of social science in its own right. And there's a lot of theories. But we do know, in order for behaviour to change, people must feel personally vulnerable to threat, view the possible consequences as severe, and see that taking action is likely to either prevent or reduce the risk at an acceptable cost with few barriers. So people need to be motivated, they need to have the opportunity to change, they need the knowledge to know how to change, and they need the encouragement with few barriers to make sure that they continue to make that change. So it is actually quite an important and often can be the barrier to change if we don't get it right. So concluding, first of all, just going back to social license, it's important for us to recognise as an industry group that we cannot self-award our own social license, and we can't deem ourselves to be socially acceptable. We have to understand that that comes from outside. We need a trust relationship that is maintained not just with people outside of our industry, but also by making sure that we bring people inside the industry along with us. We need change for the industry to also incorporate a human behaviour change model or approach, or a number of approaches, to be able to ensure that information that we gain around environmental impact and sustainability and equine welfare can be actually proactively addressed. We cannot proactively address them with just research data, because people will often place emotion or resistance or whatever in play, you know, as their first kind of as their way of looking at this, and we need something a bit more than just the data. I would just say, if we talk about responsible equestrians, then these are people who positively engage with both perception and reality. They show real commitment to change to ensure maintenance of their social license for involving horses in sport and leisure, not just by what we say, but by what we're seen to be doing. And that is the end of my talk, just to remind you that we are all responsible. Thank you for your attention. Figure out how to stop sharing now.
If you go back to the previous slide, can you do that now? And I think your concluding remarks are extremely important. Extremely important. I mean, the first one, that we cannot do a self-award, and that's of course very, very right. And we need to earn the award, and that's why we need the insights, we need the knowledge, and then to know what we need to do to adapt or change. So I think you're very spot on with this concluding remarks.
Thank you. Right. In the chat. Very good. After, could we please see the colourful slide about human behaviour change? I'm sure these slides are all going to be PDF'd and shared anyway, I'm assuming, yeah. So you can see it there, but to be honest, it's not my picture. It's a picture that you can pick up off the internet. It's called the Human Behaviour Change Wheel. And if you have a look at it and have a read of it, you can see it's got some good ideas that you can apply in any aspect of your life.
In the work that you've done then, Nat, how have it been received? Do you see that there is an understanding from what you're presenting, there's a willingness to adapt, or what's your view of the outcome, what you've done?
Well, Theo always remains very silent in these matters, I find, but Theo and I are both members of the Commission. And I think that, generally speaking, most people have been very positive about the approach that we've taken, the recommendations that we've made. But, you know, as with many things, when it is a recommendation that perhaps has a greater impact on one group than another, then you're more likely to get, you know, more questions, perhaps needing more data or more evidence in order to be a bit more convincing. And so I would say that, you know, we've had positive feedback, but we've also, you know, we've had to engage with those who perhaps haven't felt as if we've understood them well enough, or that we've, you know, they felt that the finger has been pointed unnecessarily, those sorts of things, and try and, you know, and try and ensure or reassure that that is not the case. Because, you know, I mean, our job is to try to make recommendations that, you know, are the sorts of things that people believe can be done, but also believe will make a difference and that they can incorporate within, you know, within their own worlds.
I have found the equestrian sport being extremely conservative. So when we look at what we're doing, we tend to do what we always have done. Whilst what's going on in the bigger society is that we have a pace of change right now, which have never been as fast as it is today, and it won't be this slow in the future. So I think the environment is changing so much while we are pretty conservative. So do you see that the resistance within the sport, whilst there are bigger needs outside the sport? Or what's your view?
Yes, I think that that's what I wouldn't say. I think that a lot of things have become quite normalized within the equine industry. We have a lot of tradition, and we base a lot of how we manage horses on tradition. So if I think back to when I first started to muck out horses' stables and dispose of their dung in a dung heap that I spent ages making into a very nice dung heap, and then that dung was burned. Actually, I seem to remember there was always a burning pile of dung in the stable yards that I worked in. Now that's probably not happening now, but we still have similar sorts of behaviours, where we have dung and people dispose of it in very different ways, and they probably don't think necessarily always about what they should or shouldn't be doing with it. And then we have the same with horse riding. People are being taught as they come into the sport, to do things very similarly to their masters, to the people who were the coaches and how they were taught. So you have this kind of progression of practice, if you like, that isn't always necessarily informed by the latest science or thinking. About nearly 20 years ago, I and a couple of others founded an organization called the International Society for Equitation Science. And we did that specifically because we wanted to really drive research that would be able to inform the training and riding and management of horses. Because we felt at the time that a lot of what was being done that would improve the welfare of horses was being done in the margins. That there wasn't a sort of platform to talk about training and riding and management and how the latest technology could help inform us. And I would say that over 20 years we've actually gained an awful lot more information because we've specifically focused around those things. But has it changed practice hugely? Well, not necessarily so. It takes a long time sometimes to change people's hearts and minds, even though there's more data there. Shall I answer some of the questions in there?
Yeah, maybe you should. Where do you want to start?
Anna, thank you. I'm glad that I've given you inspiration. I'm not feeling very inspirational. I'm feeling very tired because I'm all jet lagged and so on, but hopefully it didn't come across like that. And the reason I'm jet lagged and tired, David O'Brien, is that I did recently speak in Paris with the international racing community. And I would say that they are at a point where, for the most part, there is an acceptance that, first of all, they need to do things to change, and they need to engage with the non-horsey public that they rely on for their sport to be able to do that. But they also recognise, certainly I talked about it there, and I got some good feedback, that we are a single equestrian industry, that we have to speak with one voice. And and that was a good thing, because I've seen it in other industries where finger pointing or it's not us, it's them is played out, and it's not helpful in this situation. Horses are viewed as animals that are vulnerable to us, humans, and if we want to continue to be able to race, jump, do dressage, play polo, all those sorts of things, then we must get our story aligned, and we need to demonstrate very clearly that we are making changes that are favourable to the horse and obviously to the environment at the same time. Alison, you are Scottish, Alison Seggy, and you're talking about social license. And this head in the sand, yeah, well, it's not easy to make change, is it? So it's easier to put your head in the sand and, well, hope that the environmental problem goes away, and that's what a lot of people do. They deny it. They don't want to talk about climate change. I mean, how many conversations has our Wageningen colleagues had where people will say it's not climate change, it's just a blip, and it's not this and it's not that. I always say it doesn't actually matter whether it's climate change or not. What you're actually living through demonstrates very clearly that we are not prepared. And, we're not going to be able to reverse the situation that we're in. necessarily, but we are going to be able to slow it down, and we're going to get better at being able to deal with the issues that we face with the more knowledge that we've gained, and then putting that knowledge into action. It's the knowledge into action business, though, that seems to be the problem, and that's where the head in the sand business happens, or the ostrich-like behavior. But yeah, it's a good point. Most of riders, you see that most of riders pat their horses still in spite of yeah, well, it's interesting, because I think when you know something, you assume that because you see it everywhere, that everybody else knows it. But I think it's just because you are more aware of it. So most people, you know, when they come out of a I don't know, a great dressage test or a fantastic show jumping around, you see them kind of walloping their horses with their hands very vigorously, because they're demonstrating very publicly that they're very happy with the horse. And yet, from the horse's perspective, I'm not really sure that that is necessarily a very rewarding thing to have happen to them. And we do know that horses like being scratched on their withers. And that does seem to be related to things like lowering their heart rate and so on. And it seems to mimic a more of a grooming action. So, yes, you're right. From an ethological point of view, it seems that we know a little bit about what might be a preference for the horse, what's more likely to be a preference for the horse. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's general knowledge, because general knowledge, you know, takes quite a while to filter through, I think. Right, I think I've answered all of those questions.
Any more questions for Nat?
Could I ask a question then? Because I have tried to talk about sustainability and equine welfare in one package. Now, Theo introduced me to this. I'm not sure I totally agree with sustainability, with animal welfare being a chapter within sustainability, because I do think that it's a bit more important than that. However, I do understand that, you know, having really thought about it, that in fact they go hand in hand from my point of view. But I don't know whether that resonates with anyone else. What do you think? Experts in sustainability and environmental impact.
It's a tricky question to ask, and then maybe there are a lot of different opinions. What we have said from the EF point of view, we said that we need sustainable horses, sustainable humans, and a sustainable environment. So from that point of view, we're grouping everything regarding that into sustainability. But of course, there are different areas of it. I totally agree with you.
So we talked a lot about one welfare. So that's my kind of way of trying to give people reason for doing things. So I always felt like when you have a lot of competing agendas, it's better to try and pull those agendas together under one umbrella. And one welfare seemed to do that rather well by saying, well, if you improve things for human, you know, for animal welfare and animal safety, then you can address environmental issues and make sure that the environment is safe and well. And you can also, of course, make sure that if you're the person managing or riding that horse, training that horse, that your welfare is also looked after, so that you've got this kind of overlapping, grouping of what's good for one is good for all. And you really drive that one welfare approach, which I guess is what you're talking about your sustainability in all aspects of horse management and ownership. What have we got here? A lot of people agreeing that they go hand in hand. And then David O'Brien, you're saying that environmental sustainability is key regard to social license, looking at transport and feed input, we can have an impact. Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is that having more information provides us with the tools to be able to make good decisions about our horse and the way in which we manage that horse. Having that kind of decision tree or the app that allows you to plug something in that then gives you that ability to have a bit of control because you're a bit more informed, I think would be great.
You get a lot of responses on your question. Maybe you have more questions than what responses.
I think these are good questions to ask, I think, about how, I mean, all the people that are on this webinar, I'm guessing are fairly engaged anyway. You know, we're kind of speaking to the converted here. Whereas I think the important thing is how we take this forward, how we as responsible equestrians make sure that we take information and we're effective in the way we communicate that. And that's where having these kind of human behavior change models is important, because just communicating something one way doesn't always get to the audiences that we want to get to.
I think you're right again. So we tend to talk to ones who already are convinced. So you're absolutely right. So we need to reach the ones who are not yet convinced. So you're right to get a real change.
Well, I mean, I think what's interesting when you look at human behavior change and how things change, what has come about, if you reflect back on where changes have happened, even within the equestrian industry, unfortunately, changes in the size and height of fences in the Grand National or around big cross countries actually started to happen after people had a lot of accidents. So there was a burning platform. It wasn't going to be acceptable or safe to continue as it was happening. You know, there were some changes before that, but the major changes happened as a result of human safety. Helmets and helmet wearing. Again, you know, when we started to see research coming out about how many equestrians were having accidents. So I'm not quite sure what the burning platform is going to be around environmental, changing practices because we are damaging the environment by what we do. You know, is that going to require some big event? Or are there other mechanisms that will be brought into play? I mean, what's going to motivate people to change, I think, is what I'm asking.